Originally, the statue was down at the American Legion hut on 81 Greenville Street. And of course, after the Vandalism Act in 2008, the original statue came to the museum. It's currently displayed in our Andersonians and War exhibit, and a replacement statue was funded and installed at the Legion hut. This is going to be a fun one. We were talking about different topics that we could do, and it came up that we have never done a dedicated program to the Doughboy statue. When we were starting to plan the military exhibit and we had this idea for how we could incorporate the Doughboy statue into our gallery, we talked a little bit about it, but we didn't go in depth into where all he's been, the design elements originally, the design elements that are implemented now in his new form. So we thought that it'd be kind of fun to go through all that history. We're also joined by some folks from the Legion building, the W.A. Hudgens American Legion post, who is host to the replacement after the original Doughboy was torn down. So maybe we can get into that as well. I know we've already talked a little bit, and you were there the morning that he was found. It's an interesting story, and it's something that I kind of approach in a different way than some might as well. Because you think about statues and monuments as being the same thing forever, because they're made of metal, they're made of stone. These aren't things that are going to change, but they do. And the way we think about them changes. So when we get to the end, we're going to kind of circle back to that idea. How is he different now than when he was first installed? What are the meanings that are now attached to him that weren't in 1934? And some different sort of brain flexors like that when we get to that point. We were going to start off, a lot of the first questions you might have is, what does Doughboy even mean? Why do we call American World War I soldiers Doughboys? And there's a lot of different versions of this story, and Dot and I were just talking, and your understanding was that it had to do with the flower dome? Yeah. So one explanation is that this could go back as far as the Mexican-American War and being covered in dough or flour, but a variation of that is that the soil in that area was so light and the color, the adobe soil, and then they started to call the soldiers adobes because they were constantly covered in dirt. And especially the cavalry officers who would look down on the foot soldiers because the foot soldiers were even more covered in dirt. And they became the adobes, which got shortened into adobes and then into Doughboy. And then a different version of the same type of thing is that some of that material could be used to create, to kind of highlight the piping on the uniforms. And then when it got wet, it became kind of a doughy blob that would come off of the uniforms when the dirt would get wet and they were little dough blobs or what have you. So there's all kinds of different versions of this. Dot was explaining to me earlier, she had heard a version where they would bake buttons to replace metal buttons, and in the shortage time, they would possibly use these. And that was one that I hadn't heard yet. It's always kind of fun to go through the different little options there are for the reasons why things are the way they are. The American Doughboy did become somewhat of a symbol of America after World War I. And after the close of the war, efforts to honor the people who had fought in the war were very quickly undertaken. Many of you will know that at the time they didn't call it the First World War. At the time they were calling it the Great War. And it was the single largest conflict that had ever occurred, something that the world had not seen. So it was something that coming off the heels of it, people were pretty keenly aware that it was historic. And honoring the veterans of the First World War was one of the first initiatives of the American Legion, 1919 or so, that the American Legion was established. So one of their first objectives was to start these memorial projects. One of the ways that this was done was through statues. And you can see two different statues here. Ian McKesney is the designer of the statue that we have in the museum and the replica statue that replaced it at the Legion building. Again, our statue was of McKesney. The other sculptor was John Paulding, and he had titled his sculpture Over the Top. A lot of people view Paulding's statue as the copycat, but if you look at the dates, his patent was filed about 5 months prior to McKesney's patent, but they're in the same year. And the similarities are pretty stark. There was a great website, by the way, that I'll refer you all to that was put together by Les Copel. He's out of California. He was the webmaster of the E.M. Duquesne Doughboy database, which is online. You can go and check it out. He's been documenting for years where the different statues are and some of the stories that they have. But he's listed also some of the similarities between these two. And both, they have the upraised right hand, and left hands have rifles that are about hip height with a bayonet. And they both have the distinct doughboy helmets, blouse trousers, and puttees. These are like leg wraps that were common in World War I. The point of the leg wraps, especially in the trenches, it kept the mud and the moisture out of your boots. So you could wrap up your leg, and if you sink down in the mud, when you pull your foot back up, you don't have a boot full of mud. They also had a gas mask pouch and field packs and a cartridge belt. And at least originally, both of them had barbed wire at their feet that kind of represented entering into no man's land in between the trenches. So these are extraordinarily similar designs. Copel's site also includes some notes about a lawsuit that came up that sprang from the similarities. One of the quotes was that they were similar enough in the mind of Jules Bertram, the owner of the American Art Bronze Foundry in Chicago, Illinois, that he sued Duquesne and the company that he used to cast it in 1922 for copyright infringement, claiming that Duquesne's and Paulding's statues were so similar as to deceive the general public. By using the flamboyant advertising and sales tactics, cheaper materials and construction methods, Duquesne was soon able to overshadow Paulding. So at the time, Paulding's statue was selling for about $1,500, while Duquesne was undercutting him at about $800 per statue. So it was nearly half the cost. Again, this is over the top. His ad style is very different. He emphasizes when he copyrighted the design. He was before Duquesne. He wanted to make sure everyone knew he was first. But the Duquesne designs and the ads for them featured something else that's a little bit interesting. Copel's research indicated that there were about 55 Paulding statues installed in the United States, while Duquesne's number was a little bit less than 150 or so. Duquesne had made several claims that weren't really true, including one claim that he had installed more than 300 statues throughout the country, when in truth, and he also claimed that he had one in every state, but there are some states that do not have one, according to this research. Additionally, he said that he had the official endorsement of the American Legion. You can see that on this advertisement down here, selected as the official statue of the American Legion. And the source of that is that there was a design contest for the statue, and he won it. And in the process, there was representatives of the American Legion that had referred to his design as 100% perfect. So he took that, started putting official statue of the American Legion on his advertisements, and they told him to stop. They said, with legal action, they said to cease use of the quote as an official endorsement, because it was not that. It was just a compliment to his design. There were a lot of variations of the Duquesne design even in itself. Anderson's Doughboy was cast in 1934, and we'll get into more of that later, but for the time being, we're going to shift focus towards the W.A. Hudgens American Legion post. Our post here was established first in around 1919, and it was named after First Lieutenant William Augustus Hudgens, who was killed in action in October of 1918 near the Hindenburg Line. So their priority in the beginning, from the very beginning, was to start to memorialize the sacrifices of some of these World War I veterans who were returning home. Anderson's local efforts included a granite monument and flagpole and an artillery piece that you can see here. And this was installed at the intersection of Calhoun and Boulevard near Anderson University's campus. If you drive through there now, we were taught there's a little tiny blue roofed building there at that intersection, very near to that. So this was very successful. Again, the installation here that you're looking at came in 1933, this small memorial park, and in part it was funded apparently by ticket sales from World War I propaganda films that were being shown to raise money. And building off of that success is when we get the installation of the statue. Dr. E.E. Epting was commander of the post at that time, and he set about raising money for the statue itself. So in 1934, this is when we're in the middle of the Great Depression, so a lot of things are changing with production of the statues. And in fact, Duquesne redesigned in 1934. The Anderson one is a little bit unique in that respect because it was one of only 4 that he created with a closed mouth design, meaning that you can't see his teeth. Some of them have an open, and you can see some of the teeth and everything. So it's a little bit unique in that there's only 4 like it that are out there. The other change that was made was in material. So in the advertisement before, you remember we have sheet bronze statues. By 1934, when this guy was installed, they had switched production to zinc because it was less expensive to create, and it allowed him to sell the statue for $700. So if you remember, when it first came out in the early 1920s, it was $800, and then in 1934, he was able to sell it for $700. So we think that probably for around $1,000, including the installation, they were able to secure the Doughboy statue and install it on this kind of rock pedestal, if you can call it that, a mound of rock. It was in this same memorial park as well, down near the Anderson University campus. So, for reference, $700 in 2024 money, somewhere around $16,000, if you can imagine, in modern day money. So that's kind of what it looked like at the start. But upon its arrival in Anderson, the Doughboy was installed on this mound of rocks near the artillery piece, and it was dedicated on Armistice Day in 1934. This is one of my favorite images, and we really wanted to use it in the exhibit itself, and we did. But this goes to show you, Beverly mentioned I'd been here for 9 years. And for 9 years, I was completely wrong about this image. I thought, my theory was, for this whole time, has been that these names were the signatures of folks who returned from World War I, and that someone had been scratching them out, perhaps, as they passed away. And that's not the case at all. We find this 1936 article, a lot of these names you can see on the postcard image, and this is a list of the World War I deceased. So someone else, maybe the family members, had added their names to the postcard, other things. So that's just a good example of how, no matter how much you think you know, there's always something you can learn. This house here, some research kind of suggested that this was the original meeting place for the American Legion Post here in Anderson. But in 1939, Postel Cater and William Watson donated about 6 acres of land down Greenville Street, where we now see the Legion Hut as it's currently standing. So the building was dedicated in September of 39 and in honor of Major Ralph Raymer. And that's what the building looks like, of course, in the modern day. By the start of World War II, the Doughboy statue, along with the other components of the memorial park that had been down at Anderson University's campus, were all moved to the American Legion building. And there's a note on the Copel site that I was mentioning that the statue moved again closer to the street, and it was put up on the pedestal that's seen here. So either it was not originally on that pedestal when it first moved to the hut, or the whole situation was moved, or perhaps he's mistaken and it didn't move again. So time and weather and all these things take its effect. A lot of you remember the recent project that we went through restoring the Robert Anderson Fountain, and how fighting against the elements is just this constant battle that you have to go through. And the statue was no different. It had gone through a lot. And in 2003, conservationist Ted Monick undertook a restoration of the Doughboy statue. And he did quite a job. In fact, I was going to have this up here if anybody wants to check it out afterwards. This is his conservation assessment from the project that they did. So he kind of went through, listed the damages. He indicated that the original structural shape was pretty good, except for the rifle, which had broken off on either side of the left hand, and the ankles had been broken in an apparent act of vandalism. The legs were attached to the base with steel braces. So a new rifle was cast in 2003 and attached to the left hand. So he had to kind of match the patina of the rifle to the statue and do a bunch of different interesting work that I don't understand how any of it works. But he's a brilliant guy. And the whole statue was cleaned and stabilized. The legs were reattached with some steel tubing on the inside and a wax treatment. He kind of went over the whole thing with some wax. So the whole project was about $5,000 in 2003. So a Doughboy still stands in this location today, but as many of you know, it's not the original Doughboy statue. What are we going to do with the pieces? Well, they come to the museum, and these are some of them as they were laid out in one of our artifact rooms. And when I was hired in 2015, he was back there, and I asked him, what are we going to do with, why do we have it? Where did it come from? What are we going to do with it? And one of the things that came up, the idea, of course, the original idea was, well, let's put him back together and display him. So after some exploration, not only was the cost going to be very exorbitant, but there's also, when zinc is welded back together, apparently there's some sort of toxic fume that comes off of the metals that was going to make it that much more expensive to purchase the proper safety equipment and ventilation equipment that might have been needed. So that price tag was ballooning. We had essentially the whole statue, but we had to come up with a new vision for the design. And then we, of course, one of the earlier stages of planning that I got involved with here at the museum, we started planning the military exhibit back in 2017 or 2018, leading up to our installation in 2021 and 2022. So this is when we first started, and we said, you know what, this is it. We have no excuse not to include the Doughboy in this. He's going to be a feature. He's going to be put back together. We're going to dedicate a space in the exhibit for him. And this was going to be it right here. This is, of course, in the very early construction stages. It just kind of brings back interesting memories moving. This is the field kitchen covered up. It was already in place because we had to build it around it. That kitchen's never going anywhere. And then this, of course, the drone moving. It's always been hung in the gallery, but we had to move it about 15 feet or so to get the plane in position in there, and that was one of the more stressful days of my career that I've ever had. But we made it. It's there, and it's still in the air. So, but this was going to be the spot for the Doughboy, but we knew still we weren't going to be able to put him back together in the sense that he would be a restored statue. So what then would we do? These are some images that I don't think anyone's ever seen aside from us and Scott Foster, who was the artist who helped us put him back together. So Scott came in, the museum staff had been brainstorming, and we brought him this idea. He's in pieces. We know we can't put it back together as such. What if we suspended things? What if it almost looked like a moment frozen in time, right? And then Scott, his wheels got to turning. We didn't know if it could work. We didn't know if this was even something possible. And Scott went to designing. So he had some renderings of some of the different pieces, like, for instance, how the face was kind of off from the different parts of the head, and the helmet had shards in it. And he was making these sketches, coming up with ways that things could be affixed, going up through the legs and creating stability where there was not stability. Put all these drawings together and came back to us. Here's what it'll cost. We can do this. It's going to be amazing. So we said, get going. Let's see it. We were excited to see the final product, and he did a wonderful job. Here are some in-progress photos when he was working on it. And when we see the finished product back there, it might be easier to put this all together. But this is sort of an internal structure that was installed, especially around the waist of the body of the statue, was able to attach really firmly. So that's where a lot of the weight's carried, is the belt line, heading down through the feet into the base of the statue. And then this series of cables to suspend different pieces of the face and the helmet from what would be a plate that would be above the ceiling. So he was getting to work on it. And this is on opening night. You can see the postcard image that we were able to use as one of our wall murals next to it. And it's looking pretty good. We changed the angle of the rifle had to change a little bit. You'll notice that difference. And of course, the different pieces as they're sort of suspended in air. How are we going to interpret this? So this is some text from some of the things that we had written leading up to the exhibit opening. Interpreting this piece will be done primarily in the context of memory and defining the concept of honor. So the act of erecting a monument is one means of establishing a perpetual public memory, like a shared memory. People can agree on certain parts of it. Additionally, an act of vandalism on it could be seen as a dismissal of the public memory. So the Doughboy statue will be displayed in its broken form as a case study of memorials and monuments in public spaces and how they develop a culture in shared space and the development of the physical landscape of memory in Anderson. So this interpretation now, we believe, is not limited to World War I soldiers, as the disparate pieces of the statue will now be able to represent memorials from a host of times and places. In its new form, the statue can represent many iterations of honor, in the sense that it was intended by its designer, by the locals who originally erected it, by those who chose to bring it down, by those who erected its replica, and in the eyes of those who have viewed it across time. So he's kind of become something different now. Here's a statement from Scott about the work that he did as an artist. He said, "This piece presented an inspiring challenge as I sought to take something precious that was broken and restore it to convey its former glory and prominence. It was part art, part engineering, as I reconstructed the skeletal pieces and suspended the facial components. I wanted the trauma of the broken soldier to remain, symbolic of the destruction of the original sculpture and the collective pain of World War I soldiers." So you can see how, you might think that the monument or the statue or the plaque doesn't change over time because it's made of something very static. But when in this case something very distinctive happened that we can point to an event that might have changed it. But in other situations, just the society that changes around a fixture in the community can change the way that it's viewed. History is nothing but a debate. It's a huge argument all the time, and that's one of the best parts of history, is that things can mean different things to different people. So monuments are one of those places that we can look for examples of all of these different arguments and debates that are had over time. And they're also places that we can look for little bits of our own identity as we are reflected in the things that are installed around us, even if we didn't install them.